It was a typical Tuesday morning at Ridgewood High School, the kind of morning that felt like any other, until it didn't. The sun streamed through the classroom windows, casting a warm glow over the rows of desks. Students were quietly chatting, shuffling through books, and settling into their seats. Michael Parker, a 16-year-old high school junior, was sitting in the back, staring out the window, lost in thought. He had a lot on his mind, but the sound of the bell ringing snapped him back to reality. "All right, settle down," called out Mr. Johnson, the music teacher. He was in his mid-40s, with a buzz cut and an air of superiority that rubbed most students the wrong way. Everyone in the class knew he didn't like Michael, and frankly, Michael didn't like him either. Mr. Johnson's sarcastic remarks and sharp comments seemed to find their way to Michael more than anyone else. But today was going to be different, or so Michael hoped. "Today, we're going to talk about the importance of music in society," Mr. Johnson continued, flipping through his notes. "Music is about more than just sound, it's a reflection of who we are." He paused, eyes scanning the room. "But I'm sure some of you wouldn't understand that." His gaze lingered on Michael for a moment, just long enough for the entire class to feel the tension in the air. Michael's heart sank. This was nothing new. Mr. Johnson had a way of belittling him in front of the entire class, and today was no exception. Michael had learned to tune out the teacher's mocking comments over the years, but something about the way Mr. Johnson looked at him today made his stomach twist. "Let's see if any of you can play something that reflects who you are." Mr. Johnson smirked. "Michael, since you're so into music, how about you show us how it's done?" The class went silent. Michael's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, trying to keep his cool. His mind raced. He knew what was coming. Mr. Johnson didn't expect him to play anything impressive. In fact, he probably hoped to make Michael look foolish. Michael wasn't just any student, though. He was a black teenager who had always felt like an outsider in this predominantly white school. It wasn't just the music class where he felt it, it was every corner of Ridgewood High. But his talent for piano was something that he held on to, something that gave him a sense of identity and worth in a world that often tried to tell him otherwise. With a deep breath, Michael stood up and made his way to the piano at the front of the class. His legs felt like lead, but he pushed through, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could prove something, not just to Mr. Johnson, but to himself. "Don't mess this up," Michael whispered under his breath as he sat down at the piano. He placed his hands on the keys and took a moment to steady his nerves. The cold, polished keys beneath his fingers seemed to offer a small comfort. Michael had played piano since he was little, taught by his grandmother, who had always been his rock. She'd told him music was the one thing nobody could ever take from him, that it was his voice when words failed. But now, in this moment, his hands felt strangely heavy, his fingers unwilling to move the way he knew they should. Mr. Johnson's eyes bored into him, a judgmental glint in his gaze. The room felt stifling. "Come on, Michael. Show us what you've got," Mr. Johnson called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise, the tension, the way everyone was looking at him. He thought of his grandmother, her encouraging words, and the hours they'd spent together at that very piano. She believed in him. She had always believed in him. Finally, Michael's fingers found their rhythm. He started with a simple melody, one that he knew well, a song his grandmother had taught him, a slow, soulful tune that always made him feel grounded. The music began to flow, his fingers dancing across the keys as the sound filled the room. His heart, which had been pounding in his chest, began to settle, and for the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace. But then he heard it. A low chuckle from the back of the room. A few snickers. It was Mr. Johnson. He was mocking him, clearly unimpressed. Michael didn't let it stop him. He pressed on, playing with more passion, more conviction, his fingers moving faster now, sweeping across the piano like they had a mind of their own. He played a song that spoke to him, something that told the story of his life, of hardship, of dreams, and of overcoming obstacles. The room grew quieter as his music swirled through the air. He was no longer just playing, he was telling a story, pouring his heart into every note. For a brief moment, the world outside the classroom seemed to fade away. Michael was no longer just a student being humiliated by a racist teacher. He was an artist, someone who could transcend the labels placed on him. And then, just as he was about to finish, there was another comment. "Well, that was interesting," Mr. Johnson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I guess it's true what they say, there's always someone who thinks they're special." The words stung, but Michael didn't let them affect him. He stood up from the piano and faced the class, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding himself together. He didn't need Mr. Johnson's approval. "Thanks," Michael said, his voice steady despite the hurt that lingered just below the surface. "I'm done here." He turned and walked back to his seat, the weight of the moment settling on him. As he sat down, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were silent, some were whispering, but none of them spoke up. Not one person came to his defense. They just watched him, and in that silence, Michael realized something: he didn't need them to speak for him. He had already said everything he needed to with his music. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What would you do if someone tried to break you down? Stay tuned for what comes next, because this story isn't over yet, Michael thought as he stared ahead, his fingers still tingling from the piano keys. There was a fire inside him now, one that wouldn't be extinguished by the words of a racist teacher. He wasn't done yet. Michael sat quietly at his desk, the tension from the piano performance still hanging in the air. The echoes of Mr. Johnson's snide comments reverberated in his mind, but this time, he wasn't angry. He was thinking about his life, his past, the struggles that had shaped him into who he was. He glanced out the window again, as if the view might offer him some relief from the weight of his thoughts. He thought about his grandmother, the woman who had raised him, who had always been his biggest supporter. Without her, Michael wasn't sure where he'd be today. It wasn't just about the piano, it was about everything she had taught him about strength, resilience, and believing in himself, no matter what anyone else said. "Remember, Michael," his grandmother had said when he was younger, "music is the one thing no one can take away from you. It's your voice, your heart. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words had stuck with him through thick and thin. But life hadn't always been easy for Michael. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, surrounded by violence and poverty, wasn't easy for anyone, but it was especially difficult for him, a black kid trying to navigate a world that often didn't see him as equal. His parents had split when he was just a toddler, and his mom had moved far away to pursue her career. She would call him every now and then, but it wasn't the same as having her around. He'd lived with his grandmother, who worked long hours at a local grocery store, just to make ends meet. Michael spent his days at school, where he was often the target of bullying and discrimination. It wasn't just the kids who gave him a hard time, it was the teachers, too. He could count the number of times a teacher had truly believed in him on one hand, and that was being generous. But despite all of that, Michael had always found solace in one thing: music. At the age of 5, his grandmother had enrolled him in piano lessons. He wasn't the most talented child in the class, but he had a passion for it, something that not many people could see. His grandmother saw it, though, and she encouraged him every step of the way. The piano became his escape. It wasn't just about playing, it was about expressing everything he felt but couldn't say out loud. He poured his heart into every piece, every note. It was like the piano gave him a way to speak when words failed. His friends at school didn't understand. They saw him as just another black kid from the wrong side of the tracks, and they made sure to remind him of that every day. They didn't get why he loved playing piano, why he spent so much time practicing instead of hanging out or playing basketball like the other boys. "What's the point of learning all that classical stuff? Ain't nobody got time for that," one of his friends had said once. But Michael didn't care. He loved it. The piano was his connection to something bigger, something more meaningful than the petty squabbles at school or the narrow expectations others had for him. And his grandmother, who had taught him how to play, always told him that he could make something of himself if he just kept going. Michael could still remember the first time he played a song all the way through without any mistakes. He was 8 years old, sitting at the old upright piano in his grandmother's living room. She had been sitting next to him, watching with that proud smile on her face, her hands resting on her lap. He'd been practicing the same piece for weeks, his fingers stumbling over the keys, but that day, something clicked. He finished the piece, and his grandmother's voice had filled the room, soft but filled with pride. "That's it, Michael. You've got it. Keep going." But things at school hadn't gotten any easier. If anything, they had gotten worse as Michael got older. As a black teenager at Ridgewood High, he was often the target of microaggressions, casual racism, and outright prejudice. People didn't see him as an individual, they saw him as a stereotype. And Mr. Johnson, the music teacher, was one of the worst offenders. It wasn't just the way Mr. Johnson treated him in class, it was the little comments, the passive-aggressive remarks, the way he seemed to go out of his way to belittle Michael at every opportunity. Michael had heard enough of it by now. It wasn't just the usual schoolyard taunts, it was the way Mr. Johnson, as an adult and a teacher, felt entitled to undermine Michael's worth. "Music is more than just a way to pass time, Michael. It's about passion and dedication," Mr. Johnson had said to him once. "But I'm not sure you have either of those." That comment stung. But Michael refused to let it define him. Every time Mr. Johnson mocked him, every time he made him feel less than, Michael held on to the one thing that no one could take away, his music. Even on days like today, when everything felt like it was falling apart, when it seemed like Mr. Johnson was trying to break him down in front of his classmates, Michael knew there was something bigger at play. He wasn't just a student in a classroom, he was an artist, a musician who had something to say. After school, Michael would return to his grandmother's house, his safe haven, where the chaos of the world couldn't touch him. She would be there, always with that smile and those words of encouragement. And when the world got too heavy, he would sit at the piano and let the music wash over him, carrying away the weight of everything. That's where he found his strength. And no matter how much people like Mr. Johnson tried to tear him down, Michael wasn't going to let them win. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Michael packed up his things and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. But this time, something was different. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking into a battle. He felt like he was walking into his purpose. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Stay tuned, because Michael's story is far from over. This is just the beginning, he thought, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The next day, Michael walked into school with a sense of determination that he hadn't felt in a long time. His usual anxiety, the constant unease that gnawed at him as he walked through the hallways of Ridgewood High, was still there, but it wasn't as overwhelming. Something had shifted inside him, something sparked by his performance yesterday. It wasn't just about playing the piano, it was about standing up for himself. For once, he didn't feel like the outsider, the target of jokes or scorn. As he made his way to his locker, Michael felt a strange sense of hope. He had stood up to Mr. Johnson's ridicule, and although the teacher's sarcastic remarks still stung, he hadn't let them break him. For the first time, Michael realized that the most powerful weapon he had wasn't just his music, it was his ability to not let others define him. "Yo, Mike," a voice called out from behind him. He turned to find his best friend, Malik, waving at him. Malik was one of the few people who truly understood him, who didn't judge him for his love of music. They'd known each other since they were kids, and despite the differences in their personalities, Malik was more outgoing, always cracking jokes and being the life of the party. He had always supported Michael, especially when it came to his music. "What's up, man?" Malik said, falling in step beside him. Not much, Michael said, the corner of his mouth twitching upward into a half-smile. Just trying to survive another day. Malik laughed. Survive? Bro, you've been surviving your whole life. You need to start thriving. Michael chuckled at that. Maybe. But thriving sounds a lot harder than surviving. Malik gave him a sideways glance. You don't have to do it alone, you know. You've got people here who got your back. You think Mr. Johnson can keep getting away with what he did to you yesterday? Nah, man. Not on my watch. Michael paused for a moment, taking in what Malik had said. It wasn't just his grandmother who believed in him anymore. It wasn't just about facing down Mr. Johnson's jabs on his own. Malik was right, there were people who cared. You think it'll make a difference if I say something? Michael asked, his voice quiet but earnest. Malik nodded, his expression serious. Hell yeah. Sometimes, people don't realize what they're doing until someone calls them out on it. You don't have to keep letting him get away with that crap, Mike. Michael felt a spark of something inside him. Maybe Malik was right. Maybe it was time to stop letting Mr. Johnson's cruelty slide. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. Not with a teacher who had so much power, so much influence over his classmates, the ability to manipulate their opinions with just a few well-placed words. Still, Michael knew something had changed. It wasn't just the performance, it was the realization that his voice mattered. That he didn't have to keep letting others define who he was. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to speak up. The bell rang, signaling the start of the first period. Michael sighed, steeling himself for the day ahead. His next class was English, and he had a major test to prepare for. But for the first time, he felt like the day wasn't going to be a battle. It was just another step forward. The day dragged on. Classes blurred into one another, with teachers droning on and students tapping their pens impatiently. Michael sat through them, not really focusing, his mind elsewhere. His thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Johnson and the piano performance. He was still fuming, but there was something else beneath the anger, something more powerful, more purposeful. It wasn't just about playing well for the teacher's approval. It wasn't about getting praise or recognition. It was about him, about who he was and the story he had to tell. By the time lunch rolled around, Michael was feeling restless. He grabbed his tray, sat down at the far end of the cafeteria, away from most of the other students. Malik sat down across from him, looking concerned. Bro, what's going on? Malik asked. You look like you're a million miles away. Michael shrugged, but the weight of everything was heavy on his chest. I'm just tired, man. Tired of all the stupid stuff at school. Tired of dealing with people like Mr. Johnson, who think they can talk down to me. Malik raised an eyebrow. So, what are you gonna do about it? Michael hesitated. I don't know yet. I don't want to make it worse, but I can't just let him keep doing this. I've got to stand up for myself, you know. Malik leaned forward, his eyes intense. I think it's time you do. You've got the talent, Mike. You've got the heart. Why let some jerk like him keep making you feel less than? Michael looked down at his food, not really hungry. He had been wrestling with this all day, whether or not to speak up, to finally call out Mr. Johnson for what he had been doing. Part of him was scared. Scared that it would make things worse. Scared that he'd become an even bigger target. But there was another part of him, the part that had found his voice through music, that told him he couldn't let this go on. You're right, Michael finally said, his voice firm with conviction. I'm going to do something about it. I'm not going to just let it slide anymore. Malik grinned. That's what I like to hear. I've got your back, man. Always. Later that afternoon, after the final bell rang, Michael walked to the music room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had made a decision. He wasn't going to let Mr. Johnson get away with his behavior. Not anymore. As he pushed open the door to the music room, he saw Mr. Johnson standing at his desk, his back turned, as if he was preparing to leave for the day. Michael hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped inside, his step steady and purposeful. "Mr. Johnson?" Michael said, his voice clear. Mr. Johnson turned around, an eyebrow raised in mock surprise. Well, Michael. What can I do for you?" "I need to talk to you," Michael said, his voice unwavering. The teacher's smirk faded slightly, replaced with a cool, calculating gaze. "All right. What's on your mind?" Michael took a deep breath, the words feeling heavier than he expected. But they were the words he needed to say. "What happened yesterday in class? That wasn't okay. You made a mockery of me, and I'm not going to just sit back and take it anymore. You need to respect me, just like you respect every other student in this class." Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "You're overreacting. I was just trying to challenge you." "No, you weren't," Michael shot back. "You were trying to put me down. And I'm done letting you do that." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Mr. Johnson's expression softened, just a little. "Fine. But don't expect me to treat you like everyone else just because you play a good tune on the piano. That's not how the world works." Michael didn't back down. "Maybe not. But I'm not going to let you treat me like I don't matter anymore." And with that, Michael turned and walked out of the room, feeling a small but important victory surge through him. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But Michael knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how powerful they seemed, make him feel small again. The days after Michael's confrontation with Mr. Johnson were anything but easy. The moment he stepped out of that music room, he felt a brief surge of relief. He had stood up for himself, and that in itself was a victory. But as the hours passed, the reality of what he had done settled in. He was walking a fine line now. Michael could feel the change in the air at school. He was more aware of the whispers that followed him in the hallways, the strange glances from his classmates. Some seemed curious, others skeptical. A few seemed to pity him, like he had just signed up for an uphill battle he wouldn't win. But Michael didn't care. He was tired of hiding. Tired of being the quiet kid who let things slide. If he had to face the consequences of speaking up, then so be it. At least he knew he was doing the right thing. That morning, as he walked through the school doors, his heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with this kind of tension, but it was different now. Now, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was actively challenging the world around him. His first class of the day was English, and as he sat down in his usual spot, his mind wandered to the conversation he had with Mr. Johnson. He was still trying to make sense of it all. Part of him felt like he'd won, but another part of him felt like he had just made himself a bigger target. Throughout the lesson, Michael's mind kept drifting. His teacher, Mrs. Turner, droned on about some Shakespearean play they were studying, but Michael couldn't bring himself to pay attention. His thoughts kept going back to Mr. Johnson, how the teacher had looked at him after he'd spoken up, the faint change in his demeanor. It was like Michael had struck a chord, but he couldn't tell yet whether it was a chord of respect or one of disdain. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Michael grabbed his things quickly. He had to get to the music room. He was trying to keep up his resolve, trying to avoid letting fear or doubt creep in, but it was getting harder. When he entered the music room, his eyes immediately went to Mr. Johnson's desk. The teacher was sitting behind it, his head buried in some papers. Michael took a deep breath and made his way to the piano. As he sat down, he noticed the faint sound of footsteps behind him. "Michael, can I talk to you for a second?" Mr. Johnson's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Michael couldn't ignore. "Yeah, sure," Michael replied, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. Mr. Johnson stood up and walked over, his expression neutral. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." Michael stayed quiet, waiting for the next words to come. "I think you're right," Mr. Johnson said, surprising Michael. "I've been hard on you, and I shouldn't have treated you that way. I apologize." Michael blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. The apology felt like a small victory, but it also left him feeling uneasy. Was this just an attempt to placate him? Was Mr. Johnson just doing this to make himself look better? "Thanks," Michael said, his voice cool. "But it's not just about the apology. It's about respect. I need to know that you see me as more than just the stereotype you have in your head." Mr. Johnson's eyes flickered for a moment, almost like he wasn't sure how to respond. Michael could see the shift, the way the teacher was reconsidering his position. It was subtle, but it was there. "I understand that now," Mr. Johnson said after a beat. "And I'll try to do better." For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Michael wasn't sure whether this conversation would lead to anything meaningful, but he appreciated the gesture. He didn't want to feel like he was just another kid to be dismissed. "Good," Michael said simply. "That's all I ask for." With that, Michael turned back to the piano. He didn't want to linger any longer in this awkward moment. He needed to focus on what he came here for. The music. As his fingers touched the keys, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Music had always been his refuge. It was the one place where he could escape, where everything made sense. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar notes flow through him, until the tension of the conversation seemed to melt away. But despite the apology, the uneasy feeling didn't completely go away. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mr. Johnson's apology seemed genuine, but there was something about the way he had looked at Michael, something that still felt off. As Michael played, his thoughts wandered again, back to the situation with his peers. He had always kept to himself, but now he was starting to wonder if he could ever truly fit in. Would they see him as weak for standing up to Mr. Johnson? Or would they finally respect him for doing what he felt was right? The sound of the bell ringing broke his concentration, signaling the start of the next period. Michael took a deep breath, standing up from the piano. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on him again, but this time, it was different. He wasn't going to let it crush him. He walked out of the music room with his head held a little higher, his heart still pounding. Today had been a small victory, but it was only the beginning. He had learned something important. He couldn't control what others thought of him, but he could control how he responded. And right now, he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel small. He wasn't going to let anyone dictate who he was. As Michael walked through the crowded halls, Malik caught up with him again, this time with a serious look on his face. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice low. Michael looked at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It went all right." He apologized. "But I'm not sure if I trust it." "We'll see." Malik nodded. "It's a start, man. Just keep your head up." Michael nodded, his thoughts drifting again. There was a long road ahead, but he was ready for it. He had a purpose now. He had a voice. And no matter what came next, he wasn't going to back down. That night, as he sat at the piano again, Michael reflected on everything that had happened so far. He had stood up to Mr. Johnson, and he had earned a small victory. But he knew it wasn't enough. He couldn't let this be the end of it. This was just the beginning. He played a few chords, lost in the music, and as the melody filled the room, he thought about what was to come. He wasn't sure how it was all going to play out, but one thing was certain, Michael was no longer the boy who sat quietly in the back of the class. He had found his voice, and he was going to use it. The week after Michael's confrontation with Mr. Johnson felt like walking a tightrope. Every class, every hallway, every conversation, everything felt loaded with an intensity that had never been there before. The ripple effects of his stand had begun to settle into the atmosphere of Ridgewood High, though no one was willing to openly acknowledge it. The tension that hung in the air was thick, and Michael knew he couldn't let his guard down. The strangest part was how people had started looking at him differently. Not all of them, of course. Some still ignored him, or worse, continued to follow Mr. Johnson's subtle lead, pretending nothing had happened. But others, those who had always been on the sidelines, watching but never truly engaging, now seemed to notice him. Maybe it was because they realized he wasn't the quiet kid who could easily be pushed around anymore. Maybe they were just curious. Whatever the reason, the change was undeniable. At lunch that day, Michael sat with Malik and a few of their other friends, a group that had always been tight-knit. But even here, in the midst of the people who knew him best, things felt different. The usual easy banter and joking around was laced with a sense of restraint. The conversation felt stilted, as if everyone was walking on eggshells, unsure of how to address the elephant in the room. "So, Mike," Malik said, breaking the silence as he leaned forward, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "What's the deal with Johnson? You think he's actually gonna keep his word?" Michael had been dreading this conversation. He wasn't sure how to answer. He'd never been in a situation like this before, where the stakes felt so high, where people were waiting for him to make his next move. "I don't know," Michael muttered, taking a bite of his sandwich. "I'm trying not to overthink it, but I don't trust him." He apologized, but it felt kind of fake, you know. Like he was just trying to get me off his back. Malik nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, I get that. But hey, at least you stood up for yourself. A lot of people wouldn't have done that." Michael sighed, looking down at the table. "I don't know if standing up for myself is enough. I don't want him to think he can just apologize and everything goes back to normal. I'm not gonna forget what he did." There was a quiet moment as Malik processed Michael's words. Then, his friend grinned. "Well, whatever happens, man, I got your back. And so do the others. You've got people here who respect you now. It's not just about Johnson anymore." Michael appreciated the support, but it didn't quiet the gnawing feeling in his chest. He had taken a step, but he wasn't sure if it was enough to stop the wave of consequences that might be coming. In the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could he stand up to Mr. Johnson without things getting worse? How long before the teacher found a way to take his power back? That night, after his homework was done, Michael sat at the piano again. The room was quiet, the faint hum of the streetlights outside offering the only sound. The keys were familiar beneath his fingers, soothing in a way that nothing else was. Music had always been his escape, his safe place. But now, as he played, the melody took on a different meaning. He wasn't just playing to forget the world around him anymore, he was playing because it was the only place where he could still feel like himself, still feel like he had control. His thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Mr. Johnson. The teacher's apology had been strange, almost too rehearsed, like he was going through the motions but didn't really mean it. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He wasn't sure how, but something in his gut told him the battle with Mr. Johnson was far from finished. As his fingers danced across the keys, the sound of the piano became a steady rhythm in the background of his thoughts. It was like the music was carrying him through the doubt, through the uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, he let himself feel the notes, the anger, the frustration, the yearning for respect, flow through his hands. But even as the music calmed his mind, the thoughts wouldn't stop. His mind was racing with questions. What was next? What would happen tomorrow? Would Mr. Johnson back down, or was he just biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? The next day at school, Michael noticed the shift almost immediately. When he entered his first period class, there was a sense of something unspoken in the air. A buzz that hung just beneath the surface, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Michael tried to shake it off. He couldn't let himself get caught up in the drama. He had bigger things to focus on, like making sure his music performance at the upcoming talent show was flawless. But as the bell rang and he sat down in his seat, Michael felt the eyes on him. They weren't the same as before. They weren't filled with judgment or scorn. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity. Intrigue. People were watching him, waiting for him to do something. To prove that his actions weren't just a one-time thing. That he wasn't going to let himself be pushed around anymore. By lunch, the tension had only grown. The cafeteria felt louder than usual, like the chaos of the room reflected the storm brewing inside Michael's mind. He sat with Malik again, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on him from across the room. They talked about the upcoming talent show, but Michael's mind kept wandering back to the subtle looks he was getting from his peers. He knew he had just crossed a line, he had become something that others couldn't ignore. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. Mr. Johnson walked into the cafeteria, his usual smug look firmly in place. Michael's heart sank. The man had been avoiding him since their conversation in the music room, but he had a feeling that today would be different. There was no way the teacher was going to let things go quietly. Mr. Johnson glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the students, before it landed on Michael. The teacher's eyes narrowed for just a moment, and then he made his way toward him. Michael tensed. He could feel his palms starting to sweat. "Michael," Mr. Johnson's voice rang out, loud enough to draw attention. "I need to speak with you." The cafeteria fell silent. Michael's stomach twisted into a knot, but he didn't let it show. He stood up slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Malik gave him a look, a mixture of concern and support, but Michael just nodded and walked toward Mr. Johnson. "I'm sure you've heard about the upcoming talent show," Mr. Johnson began, his tone not as friendly as it had been the day before. "You've signed up, right?" Michael didn't reply right away. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into another public showdown with Mr. Johnson, but he knew he couldn't back down. He had already taken one stand. He wasn't going to let it slip away now. "I'm signing up," Michael said, his voice steady, even though his insides were screaming with tension. Mr. Johnson smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a smile that sent a chill down Michael's spine. "Good. But I want to remind you that in this competition, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing the entire school. Don't forget that." The words hung in the air, charged with meaning that Michael couldn't quite decipher. Was this a warning? A threat? Or just another way to remind him that, no matter what, Mr. Johnson had the upper hand? Michael took a deep breath, his mind racing. "I won't forget," he said quietly, meeting Mr. Johnson's eyes with a steady gaze. And just like that, the game had shifted again. The following days felt heavier. Michael had thought that confronting Mr. Johnson would bring some closure, but instead, it seemed to spark a chain reaction. Every moment was now filled with an unsettling mixture of anticipation and dread. It wasn't just the talent show looming ahead, it was the unspoken challenge that had become his daily reality. School was no longer just a place to learn or hang out with friends, it had become a battleground, where every glance, every word, every interaction was scrutinized. He couldn't escape the feeling that people were constantly watching him, waiting for him to slip up. It was as if, by standing up to Mr. Johnson, he had unknowingly thrown himself into a public spectacle. And now, he was expected to keep proving himself. Malik noticed the change too. He could see that Michael was different, distracted, weighed down by something that wasn't just the pressure of schoolwork. It wasn't the kind of stress that could be fixed with a pep talk or a distraction. No, this was deeper, more personal. "Yo, Mike, you good?" Malik asked one morning as they were walking to class together. His voice was light, but there was a serious undertone that only Michael could detect. "You've been quiet lately." Michael paused for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just a lot on my mind, man. The talent show's coming up, and I don't know. It's like everyone's expecting me to be some kind of hero now." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Hero? Nah, man, you're just doing you. It's not about being a hero. You're just standing up for yourself. Yeah, but it feels like more than that. It feels like everyone's waiting for me to mess up, Michael said, his voice a little rougher than usual. And it's not just Johnson anymore. It's like the whole school's watching, like I'm a spectacle. Malik thought about that for a moment, then gave him a grin. I get it. But don't let them define you. You got this far because you took control of your life, Mike. Don't let anyone take that from you. Michael smiled back, though it didn't reach his eyes. Malik was always good at offering a pep talk when things got tough, but the weight of what Michael was feeling couldn't be so easily fixed. They walked into class together, and Michael took his seat, mentally preparing himself for the day. It was getting harder to focus on anything other than the swirling storm of anxiety in his mind. There was a quiet hum in the back of his brain, like the constant presence of an unseen force, pushing him to prove something. His next class, history, was as uneventful as it could be. Mr. Davenport, a teacher who had a reputation for being the most laid back in the school, droned on about the American Revolution while Michael barely registered a word. He was too lost in his thoughts. How was he supposed to perform at the talent show? Could he really pull it off without screwing up? Would everyone expect him to nail it, just because he'd stood up to Mr. Johnson? The questions were relentless, and the pressure of what was coming, the inevitable eyes on him, felt suffocating. By the time lunch arrived, Michael was more exhausted than he had been all week. His mind was a tangled mess, and his stomach was a tight knot. He met Malik at their usual spot, but as he approached, he noticed that their group had been joined by a few unfamiliar faces. A couple of people from other grades, students he didn't recognize but who seemed all too aware of the tension between Michael and Mr. Johnson. "Yo, Mike. How's it going?" one of them called out with a smirk, clearly trying to get his attention. Michael recognized her as Rachel, a senior who had a reputation for being friendly with the teachers, always seeming to know the ins and outs of everything that happened around school. Michael didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say. It felt like all of a sudden, his life was no longer just his own. People were treating him like an exhibit in a zoo, constantly trying to poke at the lion to see what it would do next. Rachel, undeterred by Michael's silence, leaned in closer. "I heard you're gonna play at the talent show. Pretty brave, considering everything that's been going on. You sure you're up for it?" Her words cut deep, even if they were laced with sweetness. It wasn't an innocent question, it was a challenge. A challenge to see if Michael could keep up the persona he'd built for himself. To see if he would crumble under the pressure. "Yeah, I'm up for it," Michael replied, his voice firm despite the nervous tightness in his chest. He wasn't going to let anyone see how much this was weighing on him. He wasn't going to let Rachel, or anyone else, see that he was afraid. Rachel grinned, sensing the tension in his voice. "Well, good luck, then. I'm sure it's gonna be interesting." Michael didn't respond. He couldn't. Her words stuck with him, gnawing at him as he sat down with Malik and the others. They were talking about the talent show, but it was all just noise in his ears. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Rachel's words. She wasn't wrong, in a way. The talent show would be interesting. But not for the reasons she thought. The next few days dragged on like a slow-moving train, each one a constant reminder of the pressure building up inside Michael. The walls of Ridgewood High seemed to close in around him, and every time he looked over his shoulder, it felt like Mr. Johnson was watching, waiting for him to slip. But it wasn't just the teacher. It was the whole school, it seemed. Every student had an opinion, whether they expressed it or not. The night before the talent show, Michael could barely sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Would he perform perfectly? What if he messed up? What if he embarrassed himself in front of the whole school? And worst of all, what if it wasn't enough? What if standing up to Mr. Johnson had been a hollow victory, and now he had to prove himself in a way that felt even more impossible than before? When morning finally arrived, Michael felt like he had been awake for days. His stomach was a bundle of nerves, and he had to force himself to get out of bed and into his clothes. His hands trembled slightly as he grabbed his sheet music and guitar. He had decided to play both. He needed something that would keep him grounded, something that would let him pour all his emotions into it. As he walked to school that morning, his thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt. But somewhere beneath the fear, there was something else. A spark. A tiny flicker of determination. He didn't know what was going to happen in the next few hours. He didn't know how this would all end. But he did know one thing: he wasn't going to let the fear control him. He wasn't going to let anyone dictate who he was, what he could or couldn't do. And as he entered the school doors, ready to face whatever the day would throw at him, Michael made a silent promise to himself: he was going to give it everything he had. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as the students of Ridgewood High gathered for the annual talent show. It was a tradition that everyone looked forward to, and this year, it was impossible to ignore the tension that crackled in the air. The school was on edge. Michael had become something of a legend, almost a symbol. Whether people realized it or not, they were all watching him now. They wanted to see if he would sink or swim. Michael stood backstage, heart pounding in his chest as he waited for his turn. He could hear the chatter of students in the audience, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional bursts of laughter. The lights were dimmed, and the stage was lit by bright spotlights, casting long shadows across the gym floor. He could feel the weight of it all, the eyes of the school on him, the looming presence of Mr. Johnson somewhere in the crowd, and the pressure that had been mounting ever since his stand against the teacher. His hands, still slightly trembling, gripped the neck of his guitar. The sheet music was tucked under his arm, but he had no intention of using it. He was going to perform from memory, from heart, just like he always did when he played the piano. Malik appeared at his side, his familiar grin a welcome sight. "You got this, man. Don't let it get to you. Just play like you always do. You've got the talent, just let it flow." Michael smiled, grateful for the support. "Thanks, Malik. I'm not sure what's gonna happen after this. I just don't want to mess up." "You won't," Malik said confidently. "Just focus on the music. That's all that matters right now." Michael nodded, trying to push the nerves aside. He had come this far, hadn't he? This was his moment to prove something, not just to the school, but to himself. He had stood up to Mr. Johnson. He had refused to be silenced. And now, he was going to show everyone who he really was, not the quiet, intimidated kid they thought he was, but someone with the skill and determination to carve his own path. As the next performer wrapped up and the spotlight shifted, the announcer's voice echoed through the gym. "And now, everyone, please welcome Michael Williams, performing a medley of piano and guitar." The audience clapped, but Michael barely heard it. His heart thudded in his chest as he stepped into the spotlight. The bright lights momentarily blinded him, and the faces of his classmates blurred into an indistinct sea. But he didn't need to see them. He didn't need to hear them. He needed to feel the music. He took a deep breath and settled onto the stool at the piano. The crowd fell quiet, their eyes locked onto him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and Michael was alone with the keys. The first note rang out, clear, pure, and resonant. Michael's fingers danced across the piano, finding their way through the familiar chords and melodies. The music began to take over, and with it, a calmness settled over him. This was his space. His time. No one could take that from him. Not even Mr. Johnson. As the piece progressed, Michael transitioned seamlessly into the guitar, the sound of his fingers strumming filling the air. The combination of the two instruments was a perfect balance, showcasing his skill and his passion. The crowd was completely silent, absorbed by the music, and Michael felt something click within him. He was no longer worried about what anyone thought. He was lost in the rhythm, in the notes, in the feeling of being completely in control. The piece came to a close, and Michael opened his eyes to see the audience's reaction. There was a beat of silence, and then, like a dam breaking, the gym erupted into applause. Michael's breath hitched in his chest as he stood up, trying to absorb the magnitude of the moment. He had done it. He had played his heart out, and they had heard it. But amidst the applause, there was one face that stood out, Mr. Johnson's. The teacher was sitting in the front row, his expression unreadable as he clapped along with the others. Michael couldn't help but notice the way Mr. Johnson's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than the others. It was like a silent challenge had passed between them. But Michael didn't look away. Instead, he gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had done what he came to do. He had shown up. He had proven himself. As Michael walked off the stage, the adrenaline began to wear off, and a wave of exhaustion hit him. Malik was waiting for him backstage, grinning like a proud older brother. "Yo, that was fire, Mike. You killed it up there." Michael laughed, though it was more out of relief than anything else. "I think I survived." "You didn't just survive," Malik said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You owned it." Michael grinned, feeling the weight on his shoulders start to lift. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. The performance had been everything he hoped for, and more. He hadn't just played music, he had let go of all the fear and doubt that had been holding him back. It wasn't about winning the talent show. It was about showing everyone that he wasn't afraid to be himself. The rest of the show passed in a blur. Michael tried to enjoy the performances of his friends, but his mind kept returning to that moment on stage. That had been the turning point. He had taken control of his narrative, and no one, not even Mr. Johnson, could take that away from him. When the show was over, Michael stood with Malik, waiting for the results. The tension had returned, but this time, it wasn't about what Mr. Johnson might do or say. It was about the future. About what came next. The applause, the performance, the feeling of accomplishment, it was just the beginning. And now, the announcer's voice crackled over the microphone, "It's time to announce the winner of this year's Ridgewood High Talent Show." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting to win, he didn't even care about that. But still, the words held weight. What would this mean for him? For everything he had worked for, fought for, and struggled with? The announcer paused, building the suspense. "And the winner is Michael Williams." For a moment, the world went silent. Michael's brain took a moment to process what he'd just heard. The crowd was clapping, cheering, but Michael could barely hear them. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do. This was more than just winning a contest. It was validation, recognition, and something deeper. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for. Malik slapped him on the back with a huge grin. "I told you, man. You earned this." As Michael walked up to receive his trophy, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Not just because he had won the talent show, but because he had won something much more important, his own respect. He had faced his fears, stood up for himself, and proved that he was more than just the quiet kid people had written off. And as he looked out at the sea of faces in the crowd, he realized that this was just the beginning. The future wasn't about what other people thought of him, it was about what he thought of himself. He wasn't finished yet. This was only the start of his journey. And he was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed the talent show were a whirlwind of emotions and experiences. Michael's win had catapulted him into a new spotlight, one he hadn't quite expected. It wasn't just about the trophy, though that certainly had its perks. It was the way people looked at him now. It was the way the whispers that had once followed him in the halls had transformed into words of admiration. For the first time in his life, Michael felt like he was seen. But with that recognition came new pressures, ones that weren't just external but internal. The morning after the talent show, Michael was greeted with a flurry of text messages, Instagram mentions, and Facebook tags. Everyone from his classmates to his teachers were talking about his performance. His social media exploded with comments, and even the local news outlet picked up the story. Michael Williams, the quiet boy who had stood up to the racist teacher, now known for his incredible musical talent. He sat at his desk, scrolling through his phone in a daze. It was all too much. He hadn't anticipated this level of attention, nor did he really know what to do with it. It wasn't about the praise, it was the pressure. He couldn't shake the feeling that people expected more from him now. They were looking at him, expecting him to perform, to be the guy who always did the right thing, who always came through. But that wasn't who he was. Not really. "Mike, you're a legend." Malik's voice broke through his thoughts. He had stopped by after school to hang out. "I can't believe how many people are talking about you. You seriously killed it at the talent show." Michael gave a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, I know. It's a lot to take in, man. I didn't expect all of this." Malik nodded sympathetically, plopping down next to him on the bed. "It's a lot, but you deserve it. You've been through hell and back, and now you're getting the recognition you deserve. But hey, you don't have to carry all that weight by yourself. We're in this together." Michael looked over at him, feeling a small spark of gratitude. He had no idea how much Malik's support meant to him until moments like these. "I know, man. But, what if I mess up? What if they're all just waiting for me to fail now? What if everything I do from here on out is just me trying to prove myself?" Malik chuckled, leaning back on the bed. "Mike, listen to me. You don't have to prove anything. You did what you did because it was you. You've got talent, you've got heart, and that's all that matters. If they can't see that, then forget about them." Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It felt good to hear Malik's words, even if they didn't completely silence the doubts still echoing in his mind. There was still the looming specter of Mr. Johnson, the teacher who had started it all, the one whose attempt to humiliate Michael had backfired so spectacularly. And now, Mr. Johnson wasn't just a figure in the background of Michael's life. He was a looming challenge. The school had already begun to rally around Michael in subtle ways, his classmates were more supportive, teachers were showing more respect, but Michael knew that Mr. Johnson was not the type to back down easily. As if on cue, the following Monday in history class, Michael's worries came to a head. He walked into class, expecting a normal day, but as soon as he stepped into the room, his eyes locked with Mr. Johnson's. The teacher was standing at the front, his arms folded, eyes cold, but there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of something unspoken. Michael didn't know what it was, but it felt like a challenge. "Michael, I trust you've been getting a lot of attention lately," Mr. Johnson said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. Michael's stomach tightened. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Quite the performance," Mr. Johnson continued, his tone edged with something Michael couldn't quite place. "But remember, not everyone gets a trophy just because they make some noise." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, Michael froze. The rest of the class went silent, all eyes on him. It was as though Mr. Johnson was daring him to say something. But Michael didn't take the bait. Instead, he stood tall, looking Mr. Johnson straight in the eye. "I'm not in this for the trophy, sir," Michael replied, his voice steady. "I'm in this to show that I belong. I've always belonged. And you can't take that away from me." The class remained silent for a beat, and Michael could feel the tension in the room. But then, he noticed something strange. Mr. Johnson's expression faltered, just for a second, before he composed himself and turned back to the board. "Very well, Mr. Williams," he said, his tone dismissive. "Let's get on with the lesson." But the moment lingered in the air long after the bell rang. That evening, Michael couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He had stood up to Mr. Johnson again, but the look in his teacher's eyes stayed with him. It was a mixture of contempt and something else, something more dangerous. Michael had thought that Mr. Johnson might have let it go after the talent show, but it was clear that the battle was far from over. He sat in his room, his mind racing as he rehearsed the conversation in his head. Was there something else he needed to do? Was it enough to just stand tall, or did he need to take things even further? What was the next step in this battle? Malik knocked on his door, pushing it open without waiting for an invitation. He entered with a grin, but it faded as he saw the expression on Michael's face. What happened? Malik asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. You look like you've seen a ghost. Michael sighed, sinking into the chair at his desk. It's Johnson. He's not done with me. I can feel it. Malik didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, thinking. Well, then I guess it's time for him to see that you're not going anywhere. You're gonna keep showing up, you're gonna keep doing your thing, and if he tries to pull something again, you're gonna be ready. And I'll be right there with you. Michael nodded slowly, the weight of Malik's words sinking in. He was right. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The battle wasn't over, but Michael was beginning to realize something important: he had already won. It wasn't about the teacher. It wasn't about the talent show. It was about who he had become along the way, the boy who refused to back down. The boy who stood up, even when the odds were stacked against him. And whatever came next, he was ready. The days that followed felt like an emotional roller coaster for Michael. Though the school had shown him unexpected support, especially after the talent show, the shadows of his confrontation with Mr. Johnson loomed larger than ever. The encounters with his teacher became more strained, the cold glares from across the classroom more pronounced, but Michael refused to let it affect him. He had learned one thing during the past few weeks: no matter how difficult things became, he couldn't let anyone break his spirit. It was a Monday morning, and Michael could feel the weight of the week ahead already pressing on his shoulders. As he walked into history class, he noticed that the tension in the room was palpable. The students were quieter than usual, their chatter subdued. There was an uneasy feeling in the air, a feeling that Michael couldn't quite shake. He sat down at his usual seat, trying to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting back to the escalating situation with Mr. Johnson. The teacher had started acting in more subtle ways, remarks that weren't necessarily cruel, but were just off enough to make Michael uncomfortable. He could feel the hostility simmering under the surface. The bell rang, and the students fell into an expectant silence. Mr. Johnson walked into the room with his usual stern expression, but there was something new in the air. A sharpness to his movements. He was different today, more focused, more controlled. As if he were waiting for something. Michael's heart began to race. "All right, everyone," Mr. Johnson began, his voice cool and measured. "We're going to switch things up today. I've noticed a disturbing trend in my classroom. Some students seem to think that the rules don't apply to them, specifically, certain students who believe that they can act above reproach because they've gained some temporary popularity." Michael stiffened. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The entire class was now looking at him, and for a moment, he could almost feel the room shift. He could see the subtle glances exchanged between some of his classmates. They were waiting for him to react. But Michael knew better than to let Mr. Johnson get the reaction he was hoping for. "I'm referring to the recent talent show," Mr. Johnson continued, his gaze locking onto Michael with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "It's quite clear that some of you have been granted undeserved attention for the sake of, what, exactly? A performance? A one-time event that, frankly, has no bearing on your academic worth." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had expected it, but the sting of Mr. Johnson's words still cut deeper than he imagined. It wasn't just about his talent. It was a reminder that, to some people, he would always be an outsider. He wasn't supposed to belong. His success was an anomaly, a glitch in the system. He felt his fists clench under the desk, but he forced himself to breathe. He wasn't going to let Mr. Johnson have the satisfaction of knowing how much his words hurt. The rest of the class was completely still, watching Michael like they were witnessing a showdown between two opposing forces. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if everything had come to a boiling point. And in that moment, Michael realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just a battle between him and Mr. Johnson. It was a reflection of the world he had been trying to navigate, one where people constantly tried to put him in a box, to label him, to make him fit into some narrow narrative that didn't represent who he truly was. He was tired of it. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, but there was a quiet power behind it that even surprised him. If you think my talent was about undeserved attention, Mr. Johnson, then maybe you don't understand what talent is. Talent isn't about the attention it gets or the people who notice it, it's about what you bring to the table, whether anyone is looking or not. A tense silence fell over the room. The students exchanged glances, some of them whispering to each other. Mr. Johnson's face was unreadable, but Michael could see the flicker of something, anger, disbelief, maybe even regret. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. You can call it what you want, Michael. But remember, in the real world, it's not always about what you can do, it's about who you know, and how you present yourself. Michael's eyes narrowed. Well, I guess I'll figure that out, won't I? He replied, his tone unwavering. There was a beat of silence before Mr. Johnson simply nodded and moved on to the lesson. But the damage had already been done. The class was no longer focused on the history lecture. They were focused on the tension that had escalated between the two of them. Michael could feel it in the air, thick and unyielding. There was no going back. Later that afternoon, Michael found himself walking down the hallway, deep in thought. The weight of the exchange with Mr. Johnson still pressed on him. He was tired. Tired of fighting battles that seemed to have no end, tired of being scrutinized by someone who had no intention of understanding him. But there was something else gnawing at him, something that he couldn't shake. What if he was wrong? What if he was fighting for the wrong reasons? What if his resistance was only making things worse? As he walked toward his next class, he saw a group of students gathered by the lockers. They were laughing, talking animatedly, and for a moment, Michael felt like an outsider again. That familiar feeling crept up on him, like he was watching from the outside, never fully included in the world around him. But then, as he passed by, a voice broke through the noise. Hey, Mike. He turned to see Malik approaching, a grin on his face. Yo, what's up? Malik said, slinging an arm around Michael's shoulders. You good? I saw what happened in class. Don't let that guy get to you. Michael smiled, grateful for his friend's support. I'm trying not to, man. It's just hard sometimes, you know. I'm tired of always having to prove myself. Malik nodded sympathetically. I get it. But you don't have to prove anything to anyone except yourself. You already did that. And you keep proving it, every day. Michael felt a weight lift from his chest, if only a little. It wasn't a solution to everything, but it was a reminder. He didn't need anyone's approval to keep going. The fight wasn't over, and maybe it never would be. But one thing was certain, he was never going to stop being himself. As they walked to class together, Michael realized that this was his fight, his journey, and no one could take that away from him. Not even Mr. Johnson. The storm was far from over, but Michael was ready for whatever came next. The tension between Michael and Mr. Johnson simmered for weeks, but things seemed to reach a boiling point when the semester neared its end. Michael could feel the change in the air, like a storm was on the horizon, just waiting to break. The days grew longer, and the pressure mounted, both from the outside world and from within himself. The attention he had gained from the talent show was now a double-edged sword. It wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about holding on to the person he had become. It wasn't that he was afraid of the storm. Michael was tired of being afraid. He was tired of feeling small. Tired of hiding in the shadows. But what if the storm wasn't just going to hit him? What if it was going to take everyone down with it? The day it all changed started like any other. Michael sat at his desk, his thoughts wandering as he absent-mindedly took notes during Mr. Johnson's history lecture. The subject matter was irrelevant now, nothing seemed as important as the looming confrontation that had yet to come. Michael's mind kept returning to one question: what happens when a battle with someone like Mr. Johnson reaches its breaking point? He didn't have an answer, but he had a growing feeling that he was getting closer to finding one. Mr. Johnson's voice broke through his thoughts. "Michael, I trust you're paying attention." Michael looked up, startled, but his gaze was calm. "Yes, sir. I'm listening." Mr. Johnson narrowed his eyes, clearly not buying the response. "I hope you're not letting that talent show go to your head. This is history class, not a stage for your performances." The words were laced with venom, and the students around Michael grew quiet. There it was again, Mr. Johnson's passive-aggressive jab. Michael could feel his chest tightening, but he refused to let his anger show. Not this time. Not when he had so much more to prove. But before he could respond, a voice from the back of the room interrupted. "Mr. Johnson, lay off him. It's not his fault you're bitter about losing the bet." The entire class turned toward the source of the interruption. Malik stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed defiantly. There was a brief, stunned silence before a few chuckles rippled through the class. Michael's heart skipped a beat, surprised by Malik's boldness. He wasn't the only one. Mr. Johnson's face reddened, his jaw tightening. He was losing control, and everyone could see it. "What did you say, Malik?" The teacher's voice was low and threatening. Malik shrugged nonchalantly. "You heard me. You lost the bet. And now you're taking it out on Michael. Maybe you should let it go." The room went dead silent. The other students exchanged nervous glances, waiting to see what would happen next. But Michael was riveted, his thoughts spinning. He had known that Malik was bold, but this? This was a different level. Mr. Johnson stood there, speechless for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain his composure. "You're out of line, Malik. Go to the principal's office. Now." Malik didn't move. Instead, he stood there, meeting Mr. Johnson's gaze with a level of defiance Michael hadn't seen before. The class held its breath. "Do it," Malik repeated, this time with more force. "Send me to the office. I'll take it. But you know what? The truth is, you've been treating Michael like crap for months, and it's time someone called you out on it." Michael could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a turning point. For the first time, someone else was stepping up for him. Someone else was fighting the battle, too. Malik was standing tall, challenging Mr. Johnson in a way Michael had never dared. It wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about the injustice they had both witnessed, the system that allowed it to continue. After a long, tense silence, Mr. Johnson's anger flared. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think you can challenge me in front of my class? Get out of my sight, Malik. Now." Malik held his ground for a moment longer before finally speaking. "Fine. I'll go. But just know this, you're a coward if you can't face the truth. You've lost." Without waiting for a response, Malik turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence that hung in the air like thick smoke. Michael sat still, his mind racing. He had just witnessed the turning point he'd been waiting for, but it wasn't the way he had imagined it. Malik had taken a stand, not just for him, but for everything they had both endured. And now, Michael felt the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but Michael didn't move. He stayed seated, his thoughts swirling. Mr. Johnson was furious, that much was clear, but something had shifted. The dynamic had changed. Michael knew that this battle was far from over, but something inside him had ignited. He wasn't alone anymore. Later that day, Michael sat in the cafeteria, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Malik was waiting for him at their usual spot, his expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "So, how about that for a day, huh?" Malik said, leaning back in his chair. "I figured it was time to put that jerk in his place." Michael gave a small smile, though his mind was elsewhere. "Yeah, man. That was bold. I've never seen you go off like that before." Malik shrugged. "Someone had to do it. You can't keep letting people walk all over you. And I know you've been holding this in for a long time." Michael looked at his friend, grateful for his support, but a new weight pressed down on him. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this. What if this makes it worse? What if it doesn't change anything?" Malik raised an eyebrow, his voice steady. "What if it makes it better? You can't keep hiding, Mike. You've already done something that most people wouldn't. You stood up. Now it's time for others to see that they can, too." Michael exhaled, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. The storm was coming, and it was going to be hard. But now he knew he didn't have to face it alone. As they sat there, the cafeteria buzzing around them, Michael realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for the people who had been silenced, standing up for the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. And if that meant fighting, then he was ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days that followed Malik's bold confrontation in class felt like a pressure cooker, with the temperature rising higher and higher. The tension between Michael and Mr. Johnson had shifted from subtle jabs to an openly hostile atmosphere. It wasn't just about the talent show anymore. It was personal, and everyone in the school knew it. Word had spread fast. The students, who had once viewed Michael as an anomaly, a quiet kid with big potential, now saw him as a symbol of resistance. And Mr. Johnson? He was no longer just a teacher to them. He was the embodiment of an unjust system that needed to be challenged. But as much as Michael appreciated the support, he could feel the growing weight of the battle he was now in. He had unknowingly become a representative of something bigger than himself, something he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. That morning, Michael sat alone in the back corner of the cafeteria, his lunch untouched in front of him. He stared at the plastic tray, lost in thought, but the noise around him seemed distant, muffled. The usual chatter of students, the clatter of trays and silverware, it all faded into the background as Michael replayed the events of the last few days in his mind. The confrontation with Mr. Johnson. Malik standing up for him. The whispers in the hallways. He had become the focal point of a conflict that seemed to be growing every day. But what came next? Was this just the beginning of something bigger? Or was it a flash in the pan, a brief moment of defiance before it all came crashing down? "Hey," Malik's voice broke through Michael's thoughts. He slid into the seat across from him, a confident smile on his face. "You look like you're a million miles away." Michael snapped out of his trance and gave a half-hearted smile. "Just thinking, you know." "I get it," Malik said, lowering his voice. "This whole thing's getting out of hand. I know you didn't ask for any of this, but you've got people behind you now. And that means something." Michael nodded slowly. He appreciated Malik's optimism, but it wasn't that simple. The reality was far more complicated. "I don't know, Malik. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to finish school, play my music, and be left alone. But now, I don't know what to think anymore." Malik leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the cafeteria. "Yeah, I get that. But look, man, you've got a voice now. You can either sit back and let people use you, or you can take control and make something happen. You've got a choice here. Michael sat up straighter, his eyes meeting Malik's. But what if it's too much? What if this fight makes everything worse? I've already seen how far Mr. Johnson's willing to go. Malik's expression softened. I know it's scary. But think about what you've already done. You stood up to him. You got people to listen. The school's not going to let him get away with it forever, Mike. People are watching now. And you don't have to do it alone. Michael wasn't sure if it was the certainty in Malik's voice, or the way the words hung in the air between them, but for the first time in days, he felt something other than fear. He felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe Malik was right. Maybe it wasn't about winning every battle, but about standing strong, making the world see that they couldn't be pushed down. Okay, Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But how do we even start? Malik's grin returned, wide and full of mischief. That's the spirit. First, we make sure the whole school knows what's really going on. We start getting the word out. By the end of the day, Michael knew his life had changed forever. It wasn't just Malik's words that had sparked something in him. It was the realization that he didn't have to be alone in this fight. He didn't have to carry the burden by himself. And neither did anyone else who felt silenced by people like Mr. Johnson. Later that evening, as Michael sat at his piano, the weight of the world seemed lighter than it had in days. His fingers moved over the keys in a familiar rhythm, the music flowing like a river that carried him away from the chaos. For a few precious moments, the world around him faded into the background, and he could focus on nothing but the melody. But even as he played, he couldn't help but wonder, was his music enough to carry him through this storm? Was it enough to fight the battle that loomed on the horizon? The next day, Michael found himself once again in history class. He could feel the eyes of the other students on him as he walked in, their gazes filled with curiosity and anticipation. The whispers had only gotten louder over the past few days. But Michael wasn't afraid. At least, not in the way he used to be. Now, he was focused. Now, he had something to prove. Mr. Johnson's arrival was as cold and calculated as ever. He stood at the front of the class, his eyes scanning the room before finally resting on Michael. The moment their gazes locked, Michael could feel the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. There was no love lost between them, and neither of them was willing to back down. Michael, Mr. Johnson said, his voice as sharp as a blade. I trust you're prepared for today's lesson. Michael didn't flinch. Yes, sir. Mr. Johnson gave a curt nod, but Michael could see the simmering resentment behind his eyes. There was something different about him now, something that was darker than before. And Michael knew, without a doubt, that this was more than just a classroom disagreement, it was a battle that would determine everything. As the class progressed, Michael kept his focus. He didn't engage with Mr. Johnson's subtle jabs. He didn't let the anger that was building up inside of him spill over. He kept his head down, his eyes forward, and his mind sharp. The lesson was just background noise now. What mattered was the war they were both silently waging. Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. But as Michael began to gather his things, Mr. Johnson called his name. Michael, Mr. Johnson said, his tone icy. Can I speak with you for a moment? The hairs on the back of Michael's neck stood on end. This wasn't just a casual conversation. He knew it. The others in the class filtered out, leaving him alone with Mr. Johnson. What's this about, sir? Michael asked, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. Mr. Johnson's lips curled into a tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. I just wanted to remind you that there are consequences for disrespecting authority in my classroom. Michael stood tall, meeting his teacher's gaze. I've never disrespected you, sir. I've only ever stood up for myself. If you can't handle that, that's your problem, not mine. For a moment, The air between them crackled with the intensity of the moment. Mr. Johnson said nothing, but the underlying threat in his silence was louder than anything he could have said. Then, without another word, Michael turned and walked out of the classroom. The battle lines had been drawn. There was no turning back now. The tension between Michael and Mr. Johnson was palpable, like a storm on the horizon, waiting to burst. Michael could feel it with every step he took, every moment he spent walking through the halls. The whispers were no longer just background noise, they were a constant hum in his ears. People were talking about him, talking about what had happened, and the atmosphere at school had shifted. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a symbol. And symbols, as Michael was starting to realize, were dangerous. That afternoon, as Michael was walking to his next class, he was stopped by someone he didn't expect to see, Zoe, the quiet girl from the music department. She had always been polite, but they had never really talked much. Michael had seen her around the school, but she seemed to keep to herself. "Michael," she said softly, catching up to him. Her eyes were intense, but there was a hint of something else, concern, maybe. "Yeah." Michael replied, a little surprised by her sudden appearance. "I just wanted to say," Zoe began, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot, "I admire what you did. Standing up to Mr. Johnson, that took guts." Michael blinked, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone like Zoe. "Thanks," he muttered. "But I didn't really do it for the praise. I just—" "I know," Zoe interrupted, her voice steady. "But trust me, it matters. A lot of people are watching, and some of them are scared. They don't know what to do." Michael looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Zoe hesitated before speaking again. "There are some things going on in this school that you don't know about. People like Mr. Johnson, they don't just stop at one kid. They find ways to crush everyone who gets in their way. And right now, you're the target. But that's not all." She glanced nervously around again. "They have other ways of making people disappear. You might want to be careful." The words hit Michael like a punch in the stomach. "What do you mean, disappear?" Zoe lowered her voice even further. "I can't explain everything, but you need to know that you're not just fighting Mr. Johnson. You're fighting a whole system. And people in this school, adults, students, they'll turn their backs on you if they have to. You don't want to end up as just another casualty." Michael stood there, staring at her, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He had known things were bad, but hearing it from someone who clearly knew more than he did made it all too real. It wasn't just a fight for respect anymore. It was a fight for survival. Before he could say anything, Zoe gave him a warning glance. "Just be careful, okay? Don't trust everyone who seems like they're on your side." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the hallway. Michael stood there for a moment, her words echoing in his mind. "You're not just fighting Mr. Johnson." The thought gnawed at him, a terrifying realization that he was in way deeper than he had ever imagined. The next day, after a sleepless night filled with endless thoughts and worries, Michael entered history class with a sense of dread hanging over him. The moment he stepped through the door, he could feel the change. The students were quieter than usual, their eyes avoiding his. Some whispered, but it was all so hushed, like they were afraid of being overheard. Mr. Johnson was already at the front of the room, standing like a sentinel, his face expressionless. But Michael noticed something different about him today. There was a certain coldness in the air, a sense of finality. This wasn't just a teacher with a grudge, it was someone preparing for a fight. "Good morning, Michael," Mr. Johnson said, his voice as sharp as ever. "I trust you're ready for today's lesson." Michael didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of the teacher's gaze on him, but he refused to show any sign of fear. He wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything. "I'm ready," Michael replied, his voice steady. Mr. Johnson nodded, his lips curling into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Let's see how well you handle today's challenge, then." Michael took his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension was unbearable, and it felt like everything in the room had shifted. The other students were watching, but they weren't on his side. They were passive observers, caught between wanting to support him and fearing the consequences of doing so. The lesson started, but Michael wasn't focused on the material. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation with Zoe, the warnings she had given him. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Not with what was coming. As the class progressed, Mr. Johnson seemed to take pleasure in making subtle, pointed remarks directed at Michael. He would ask questions that he knew Michael would have difficulty answering, and when Michael would respond, the teacher would find a way to discredit his answers, to make him look foolish. Every word was a strike. Every move was calculated. Finally, as the bell rang signaling the end of class, Michael was packing up his things when Mr. Johnson approached him. His voice was quiet, almost soothing, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "You seem to think you're untouchable, Michael," Mr. Johnson said softly. "That because you played a song in front of a few people, you somehow have power. But you're wrong. This is my classroom. And you will not disrespect me again." Michael looked up, meeting his teacher's gaze with defiance. "I didn't disrespect you. I stood up for myself. Something I think you can't seem to understand." Mr. Johnson's smile returned, but this time, it was full of malice. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think you're the first to challenge me? To challenge what this school represents? You're playing a dangerous game, Michael. And you'll lose." Michael stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. He didn't know exactly what Mr. Johnson was referring to, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about a teacher and a student anymore. This was about something much bigger, and the stakes were much higher than he had realized. Later that afternoon, as Michael sat in the music room, the familiar sound of piano keys under his fingers was the only comfort he had left. The notes were a refuge from the chaos swirling around him. But even as he played, the realization hit him hard: he was being pushed into a corner. And if he didn't act soon, he might not be able to fight his way out. It was becoming clear that Mr. Johnson wasn't just a teacher with an ego problem, he was a part of something much darker, a system that would stop at nothing to crush anyone who threatened its authority. And now, Michael was in its sights. The question was no longer whether he could stand up to Mr. Johnson. The question was whether he could survive the war that was about to erupt. As Michael sat at the piano, lost in thought, his fingers stilling over the keys, one thing was certain: whatever came next, it was going to be a fight for more than just his dignity. It was going to be a fight for his future. And Michael wasn't going down without a fight. The next few days felt like they were stretching out endlessly before Michael, like a road that never seemed to end. He woke up each morning with a sense of dread, a weight pressing down on his chest, but at the same time, a sense of determination began to solidify within him. He was caught in a battle he hadn't asked for, but there was no turning back now. Every decision, every step he took was going to be part of something bigger. And Michael wasn't sure if he was ready, but he had no choice but to keep moving forward. The atmosphere at school was suffocating. Every hallway felt like a maze, and every corner Michael turned, he could feel the eyes of his peers on him, some with sympathy, others with judgment. But mostly, they just watched. The students were quiet, unsure of which side to take, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Michael had become a symbol, and that wasn't something you could escape, no matter how hard you tried. It wasn't just the students. The teachers were starting to take notice too. Whispers in the teachers' lounge, glances in the hallway, everyone had an opinion about Michael and the showdown with Mr. Johnson. But what he didn't expect was the level of scrutiny he would face from the staff. He wasn't sure if it was because he had become a target for Mr. Johnson, or if they were simply caught up in the chaos, but there was a palpable shift in the way he was treated. As Michael made his way through the crowded hallway on his way to history class, he could feel the eyes of the students following him. Some avoided him, some stared with curiosity, and a few whispered behind their hands. But it was when he entered the classroom that he felt the weight of everything hit him all at once. Mr. Johnson was standing by the chalkboard, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. The moment Michael walked in, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The teacher's presence was heavy, almost suffocating, and Michael could feel the tension radiating off of him. The air between them seemed to crackle with hostility. The other students were unusually quiet, too. The normal buzz of chatter was missing, replaced by a silent curiosity that hung in the air like smoke. Michael took his seat without saying a word, his hands resting on the desk in front of him. He didn't look at Mr. Johnson, but he could feel his teacher's eyes on him. The silence stretched on until Mr. Johnson spoke. "Good morning, class," Mr. Johnson said, his voice sharp and clear. "Today's lesson will be a little different." Michael's stomach twisted. Different? He knew that tone. He had heard it before, every time Mr. Johnson had something to prove. It wasn't just about the material anymore. It was about control. Mr. Johnson turned to face the class, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Then, his gaze landed on Michael. "I hope you all understand that our class environment must be a place of respect and order," he continued, his words measured, deliberate. "But some of you," his eyes flicked back to Michael, "seem to think that rules don't apply to everyone. That is something I intend to address today." Michael's chest tightened. This isn't just a lesson, he thought, the words burning in his mind. This is a message. The teacher paced in front of the class, his every movement calculated. "Now, we'll talk about the importance of history. How it shapes us. How it influences everything we do, even our perception of those around us." He paused, letting the words settle in the room. "And how some people use it to justify their actions. Some people forget their place. Some people think they can change the rules. But the rules are the rules. And you don't get to break them without consequences." The class was eerily quiet. Michael felt the weight of the words hanging in the air like an invisible threat. He wasn't sure if it was intentional, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Johnson was trying to break him down in front of everyone, to show them who was in control. The bell rang, but Mr. Johnson didn't let up. "Everyone, stay seated," he commanded, his tone darkening. "Michael, I'd like to speak with you." Michael's heart raced. He stood up slowly, gathering his things as the rest of the class filed out. When the last student left the room, he was left standing in the midst of the silence, facing Mr. Johnson. The teacher's eyes were cold, predatory, and Michael felt a shiver of unease run through him. "Michael," Mr. Johnson began, his voice low and smooth, "I've been very patient with you, but this," he gestured toward the empty room, "this disrespect will not be tolerated." Michael met his teacher's eyes, his own voice steady but laced with defiance. "I didn't disrespect you. I stood up for myself. I have a right to do that." Mr. Johnson's smile was thin and calculating. "You think you're above the rules, don't you? You think you can challenge authority and get away with it. But let me remind you, Michael, you're not untouchable. You'll learn the hard way that actions have consequences." Michael's stomach dropped as he realized that this wasn't just about him and Mr. Johnson anymore. This was about something much bigger, something far more dangerous. Mr. Johnson wasn't just trying to get back at him for the classroom confrontation. He was sending a message, and Michael was the target. "I'm not afraid of you," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "You should be." With that, the teacher turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving Michael standing there, heart pounding in his chest. What just happened? He couldn't process it, not fully. But one thing was clear, Mr. Johnson wasn't going to let this go. The battle between them had only just begun, and Michael was caught in its center. Later that night, as Michael sat at the piano, his fingers hovering above the keys, he found himself unable to focus. His thoughts were too scattered, too full of doubt and fear. His earlier conversation with Zoe echoed in his mind. The warning she had given him had been more than just a passing comment. It was a prophecy, a glimpse into what might be coming next. And now, as much as he hated to admit it, Michael realized she had been right. He wasn't just fighting Mr. Johnson. He was fighting a system that would stop at nothing to make sure he stayed in his place. The question was, what could he do to fight back? He wasn't sure what the answer was, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't give up. He couldn't let Mr. Johnson, or anyone else, break him. Whatever it took, he would keep fighting. But as the days passed, it became clear that this fight would take everything from him. And there were moments, late at night when the world was quiet and his thoughts were loud, that Michael wondered if he would survive it. No matter how hard he played his piano, no matter how loudly the music filled the room, he couldn't escape the storm that was closing in around him. The days blurred together in a haze of stress and uncertainty. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. The whispers, the glances, the subtle shifts in how everyone treated him, it all pointed to one undeniable truth: things were escalating. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his footing. By Wednesday, things had become noticeably worse. The tension in Mr. Johnson's class was palpable. Every time Michael walked into that room, it felt like stepping into an arena where the stakes were higher than ever. Mr. Johnson had turned the volume up on his passive-aggressive tactics, making little jabs that felt more personal with every passing day. That morning, as Michael sat at his desk, Mr. Johnson stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the class with an air of superiority. He didn't speak at first. The silence felt suffocating, like a cloud of impending doom hanging over Michael's head. Today, Mr. Johnson finally spoke, his voice cool and measured. "We're going to discuss the value of discipline and respect for authority. I believe some of you could benefit from a reminder." Michael didn't flinch, but the words stung nonetheless. This is it, he thought, he's trying to break me down in front of everyone again. As Mr. Johnson went on with the lesson, his words felt like daggers, each one aimed at Michael. The rest of the class was oblivious, or at least pretending to be. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Michael could sense that everyone was quietly watching him, gauging his reactions. Some were with him, but most were either too afraid or too indifferent to take a stand. It wasn't until lunch that Michael got a moment to himself. He sat in the far corner of the cafeteria, his tray untouched, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't just keep going like this, taking the punches without fighting back. But what was the right move? If he went too far, he risked being ostracized completely. But if he did nothing, he might as well be admitting defeat. "Michael, can we talk?" Michael looked up to see Zoe standing in front of him, her eyes full of concern. She had been one of the few people who had stood by him, but even her presence didn't calm the storm inside him. "What's going on, Zoe?" Michael asked, his voice strained. He didn't have the energy to pretend that everything was fine anymore. Zoe sat down beside him, her face serious. "I've been hearing things about Mr. Johnson. Some of the teachers are talking, and I think you need to be careful." Michael's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I don't know the full story," Zoe admitted, lowering her voice so no one could overhear. "But I've heard whispers about things that go beyond just you and Mr. Johnson. He's connected to some other people in the school. People with a lot of power. And if he wants to, he could make things very hard for you." Michael sat back, trying to process her words. "So this isn't just about me standing up to him?" "No," Zoe replied, shaking her head. "It's about a whole system. And you've made yourself a target. I don't want to scare you, but you need to understand what you're up against." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected that something was off, but hearing it from Zoe made it all the more real. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was something much bigger. How far does this go? He wondered. Zoe looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. I'm not saying give up. But you need to think carefully about your next move. You've got people behind you, but you don't know who you can trust, not yet. Just be careful. Michael didn't respond right away. Her warning hung in the air like a dark cloud. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, but one thing was certain, he was in way over his head. That afternoon, as Michael walked to the music room, the weight of everything seemed to press down on him harder than ever. He had to focus on something, anything, to keep his mind from spiraling. The piano was his refuge, his escape, but even as he entered the room, he felt like the walls were closing in. The melody he played was slower than usual, each note heavier, as if the piano itself felt the strain of his thoughts. He sat at the piano for what felt like hours, letting his fingers move mechanically over the keys, trying to drown out the noise in his head. The music was beautiful, yes, but it couldn't block out the reality of what he was facing. Every note was a reminder that no matter how much he played, no matter how hard he tried to escape into the music, the world outside was still there. Waiting. Watching. He was about to stand up and leave when he heard the door creak open behind him. Turning around, Michael saw none other than Mr. Johnson standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately," Mr. Johnson remarked, his voice cold but strangely composed. "I thought you were supposed to be focusing on your studies, not hiding away in this room." Michael stood up, clenching his fists at his sides. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, every part of him was worn down. But he wasn't going to show it. Not in front of Mr. Johnson. "I'm not hiding," Michael said, his voice tight. "I'm practicing. Unlike some people, I'm trying to better myself." Mr. Johnson stepped further into the room, his eyes flicking to the piano. He said, his tone dismissive. "Music doesn't fix everything, Michael. You can't play your way out of this." Michael stood still, his breath shallow. "Maybe I don't want to play games with you. Maybe I just want to do what I love, without you getting in the way." The teacher's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing the piano, trying to distract yourself from what's really happening. But it's not going to save you." Michael clenched his fists harder, his knuckles white. He was so close to snapping, to finally telling Mr. Johnson exactly how he felt. But something held him back. This wasn't just about a fight with a teacher anymore. This was bigger. It was about survival. "So, what now?" Michael asked, his voice low but steady. "You just keep coming after me, until you get what you want." Mr. Johnson's smile faltered for a moment, and then he nodded. "You'll learn. Soon enough." Without another word, Mr. Johnson turned and walked out, leaving Michael standing there, his heart racing, his mind spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that every move he made from here on out was being watched. And if he wasn't careful, it might be his last move. That night, as Michael lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Zoe's warning echoed in his mind. "You've made yourself a target." He didn't know how much more of this he could take. The pressure, the fear, it was all starting to eat away at him. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to back down. No matter what came next, he had to keep fighting. The question was, what would be the cost? The days seemed to drag on, each one heavier than the last. Michael felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, a pressure that grew with every passing second. School had become a battleground, and though he kept his head low and his thoughts focused, he couldn't shake the sense that the worst was yet to come. The next week began with an unexpected twist. Michael had been dreading his history class with Mr. Johnson, but as he entered the room, he noticed something different. Mr. Johnson wasn't at the front of the room, giving his usual lecture. Instead, the students were all gathered around a series of posters pinned to the wall, a few even whispering to each other, clearly intrigued. It was strange, Michael had never seen anything like this before. He took his seat in the back of the room, feeling like an outsider in a room full of people he used to consider peers. There were murmurs of excitement and nervousness, but Michael couldn't bring himself to join in. His thoughts were consumed by the ongoing battle with Mr. Johnson and the growing fear that he was losing more and more ground each day. Finally, Mr. Johnson walked in, and the room immediately fell silent. The teacher's face was unreadable, his usual smugness replaced by something more calculating. He surveyed the class, his gaze lingering on Michael for just a moment longer than usual. Michael didn't flinch. "Good morning, class," Mr. Johnson began, his tone cold. "Today, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of your usual history quiz, we're going to engage in a discussion. One that will test your understanding of power dynamics and the role authority plays in our lives." Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when Mr. Johnson would try to make an example of him, turning the classroom into a stage for his personal vendetta. And it seemed like today would be that day. Mr. Johnson motioned toward the posters on the wall. They were filled with images of historical figures, powerful leaders from different eras. Some were celebrated, others vilified. But they all had one thing in common: they had been in positions of great power. "Look at these figures," Mr. Johnson said, his voice taking on a more dramatic tone. "Each of them wielded immense power, and each of them used it in different ways. Some became tyrants, others were revered as heroes. But one thing they all shared is this: authority. And authority, my friends, is something that is earned, not given." Michael could feel the tension rising in the room, the weight of Mr. Johnson's words hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. He knew exactly where this was going. "You see," Mr. Johnson continued, "when someone challenges authority, they are not only challenging the system, they are challenging the very fabric of society. It's a dangerous game to play. And sometimes," he said, his eyes locking onto Michael, "the consequences are irreversible." The entire class was silent now, their eyes flicking nervously between Mr. Johnson and Michael. Michael's palms were sweaty, and his heart was pounding. He could feel the teacher's gaze burning into him, but he refused to break. This was just another one of Mr. Johnson's attempts to assert control, to break him down in front of everyone. And Michael wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Mr. Johnson took a step forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Michael, tell us, what do you think of these leaders? Do you believe they were justified in their actions? Do you think they had the right to challenge the systems in place?" The question hung in the air, and Michael felt the eyes of the entire class on him. This wasn't just a classroom discussion. This was a test. A test of loyalty, of submission. And Michael wasn't sure he was ready to play by Mr. Johnson's rules anymore. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly. "I don't think any of these leaders were perfect," he began, his voice firm but controlled. "But they had to make difficult decisions. They faced challenges, and sometimes, the only way to create change is by challenging the system." He paused, glancing at the other students. They were watching him, waiting for him to fall apart, for him to back down. But Michael held his ground. "I don't think authority should go unchallenged. Just because someone is in charge doesn't mean they're always right." Mr. Johnson's face twitched, and for a moment, Michael saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger? Michael wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: he wasn't backing down. "Interesting," Mr. Johnson said, his voice tight. "But you see, that's where you're wrong, Michael. Authority, when respected, keeps order. It prevents chaos. You think challenging authority is the answer, but it only leads to disorder. To destruction." The teacher's words were venomous, and Michael could feel the tension building, a storm gathering on the horizon. This was no longer a lesson. This was a battle for control. And then, without warning, Mr. Johnson turned to the class. Let's talk about consequences, he said, his tone darkening. What happens when someone steps out of line? When they challenge the very foundation of what holds us together. He looked back at Michael. Let's see if anyone here agrees with you, Michael. Let's see if they think you're right. The room fell into an eerie silence as Mr. Johnson's eyes scanned the students. They all shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to speak up. They were too afraid to take a side. Michael's heart was pounding, his breath coming in short gasps. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him. This wasn't just a class anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. As the bell rang and the students began to file out of the room, Michael felt like he was walking through a fog. His mind was reeling. This isn't just about a classroom anymore. This is about something more dangerous. He could feel the pressure mounting, each moment heavier than the last. But Michael wasn't done yet. He had stood his ground, and no matter what Mr. Johnson had in store for him next, he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Later that evening, as Michael sat at the piano once more, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the keys, the music seemed to speak to him in ways that words never could. Each note he played felt like a defiance, a refusal to be silenced. The melodies flowed from him effortlessly, his mind no longer filled with doubts or fears. The piano was his escape, his sanctuary from everything that was happening. But as he played, he couldn't help but wonder, how much longer can I keep this up? The pressure was only growing, and Michael knew that the next move, his next move, would decide everything. And somehow, deep down, he knew the storm wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The storm was indeed beginning, but Michael couldn't yet see how it would unfold. As the days passed, the air around him seemed to thicken, as if some invisible force was pressing down on him from all sides. Each day, Mr. Johnson's presence loomed larger in his life, his tactics growing more insidious, more calculated. But the worst part? Michael couldn't even be sure who was on his side anymore. By Thursday, things had taken a turn for the worse. Michael had become aware of the whispers growing louder in the halls, whispers about him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the more he walked through the school, the more he realized that people were talking. They looked at him with pity, with suspicion. It wasn't just Mr. Johnson's behavior that was affecting him now, it was the way his classmates were starting to view him as a troublemaker, as a target. The worst moment came during the middle of the day. Michael had just made his way into the library to escape the noise of the cafeteria, hoping to get some peace before his next class. He was scanning the shelves, not really looking for anything in particular, when he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He turned, slowly, and saw him. It was a member of the administration, someone he had never met before but knew by reputation, Dr. Simmons, the school's vice principal. The man was known for his stern approach to discipline, a no-nonsense authority figure who upheld the school's rules with unwavering rigidity. And now, Dr. Simmons was standing right behind him, eyes narrowed, his gaze hard and unblinking. "Michael," Dr. Simmons said, his voice cold and even. "May I have a word with you?" Michael felt a chill run through him. "Sure," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Simmons led him to a quiet corner of the library, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. Once they reached the back of the library, Dr. Simmons folded his arms across his chest, his posture rigid. "I've been hearing some things about you," Dr. Simmons began, his words slow and deliberate. "And I don't like what I'm hearing." Michael's stomach twisted. "What now?" "What things?" he asked cautiously, his heart beginning to race. Dr. Simmons studied him carefully, his eyes glinting with something that Michael couldn't quite decipher. "There's a rumor going around that you've been causing trouble in Mr. Johnson's class. Some of the other teachers are starting to notice, too. Your behavior is becoming disruptive." Michael wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't him who had caused the problems, but he knew it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't listen. They never did. "I've done nothing wrong," Michael said, his voice firm. Mr. Johnson's the one who's been targeting me. He's been making things difficult on purpose. Dr. Simmons raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving Michael's face. Is that so? You know, Michael, teachers like Mr. Johnson are respected here. They have a long history of service to this school. If you're challenging him, you're not just challenging a teacher, you're challenging authority itself. And in this school, we don't tolerate that kind of behavior. Michael's pulse quickened, but he fought to remain calm. This isn't just about me and Johnson anymore, he realized. They've already decided. They've made up their minds about me. I'm not trying to challenge anyone, Michael said, forcing himself to meet Dr. Simmons' gaze. But I'm not going to let someone like Mr. Johnson push me around either. The vice principal's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Michael saw something dangerous flicker in them. You're playing a dangerous game, Michael. And trust me, you're not the only one who has something to lose here. Michael was about to respond, but Dr. Simmons cut him off. I'll be keeping an eye on you, Dr. Simmons said, his voice a low warning. And I'd suggest you think carefully about how you handle yourself in the future. If you continue to cause trouble, there will be consequences. Understand? Michael didn't say anything. What was the point? It was clear that Dr. Simmons wasn't interested in the truth. This was about control, about maintaining the system no matter who got hurt in the process. The vice principal turned on his heel and walked away without another word, leaving Michael standing there, his chest tight with frustration. How far does this go? He wondered. How many people are involved in this? By the time the bell rang for his next class, Michael was already feeling drained. The weight of everything, the constant tension, the increasing pressure, was beginning to take its toll on him. He tried to shake off the conversation with Dr. Simmons, but the words kept replaying in his mind. You're playing a dangerous game. When he entered Mr. Johnson's class, he could feel the shift in the atmosphere immediately. There was something different today, something in the air that felt charged with anticipation. As he took his seat, he noticed that several students were whispering to each other, casting furtive glances in his direction. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but most of them seemed downright nervous. Mr. Johnson stepped into the room, his usual smug expression in place, but there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He was walking with a purpose today, his steps more deliberate. As he stood at the front of the class, his eyes swept over the room, pausing momentarily on Michael. Today, Mr. Johnson said, his voice carrying an edge of authority, we're going to talk about consequences. We've been discussing power and authority all week, but today, we'll explore what happens when those in power are challenged. And believe me, there are always consequences. Michael's heart sank as he realized what was happening. This is it, he thought. He's going to make an example of me. The class proceeded as expected, with Mr. Johnson's words aimed squarely at Michael, subtly twisting every comment to reinforce his power. The teacher spoke with such authority, such confidence, that the rest of the class hung on his every word. Michael knew that if he didn't speak up soon, he would be buried beneath the weight of Mr. Johnson's manipulation. But then, something unexpected happened. Zoe, who had been sitting quietly up until this point, suddenly raised her hand. Everyone's attention shifted to her, and for a moment, Michael thought his heart had stopped. Mr. Johnson's gaze flickered over to Zoe, and he paused, clearly taken aback by her interruption. Yes, Zoe? He asked, his tone tight. Zoe stood up, her eyes steady as she looked at Mr. Johnson. I think what Michael is trying to say is that authority is not always right. Just because someone holds power doesn't mean they should have the right to control others in a way that's harmful. The entire class went silent. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Zoe wasn't backing down, and somehow, that gave him the courage to do the same. Mr. Johnson's face turned red, his anger barely contained. But he didn't respond right away. Instead, He stood there, staring at Zoe, as if weighing her words. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. But it was a silence that felt different from the ones that had come before it. This time, it was not just a sign of defeat. This time, it felt like a crack in the armor. The crack in Mr. Johnson's armor was subtle, but it was enough. For the first time in what felt like ages, Michael saw a hint of vulnerability in his teacher's eyes. It was fleeting, just a brief flicker of uncertainty, but it was there. Zoe's words had struck a chord, and Michael couldn't help but wonder if, perhaps, they were making a difference. But even as hope began to stir in his chest, Michael knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mr. Johnson was the type of person who didn't take kindly to being challenged, especially by a student like Zoe, who had always been one of the quieter ones. But in that moment, she had made a choice, and that choice had changed everything. The tension in the classroom lingered long after Zoe's bold statement. Mr. Johnson stood at the front, his jaw clenched, and his hands gripping the edge of his desk. The silence felt like it had stretched for hours, and Michael could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioner above the deafening stillness. Zoe didn't flinch. She held her ground, her eyes unwavering as she met Mr. Johnson's glare. It was as though she was daring him to do something about it, daring him to try to silence her. And in that moment, Michael realized just how much her bravery meant. It wasn't just about her standing up for him, it was about all of them, all the students who had been too afraid to speak out. Zoe had opened a door, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Finally, Mr. Johnson spoke, his voice low and controlled, though there was a tremor of anger beneath the surface. "I see we have a lot to discuss, then," he said, the words hanging in the air like a threat. "But for now, I suggest we focus on the lesson. We'll deal with this, later." The tension didn't dissolve immediately, but the class carried on in a kind of strained normalcy. Michael could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, and even though many of them had remained silent during the confrontation, it was clear that something had shifted. The undercurrent of fear that had been so pervasive for weeks now seemed less absolute. People were beginning to question, beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stand up. After class, Michael and Zoe walked out of the room together, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts. Zoe was the first to break the silence. "You good?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "I know that was a lot to take in." Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was really okay. "Yeah, I'm good. I don't know what happens next. You saw the way he looked at me, he's going to make this even harder." Zoe shrugged, her expression determined. "He might try, but that's the thing, right? He can only control us if we let him. We can't let him win, Michael. Not now. Not after everything." Michael's heart lifted a little at her words. Zoe wasn't just talking about him anymore, she was talking about all of them, about the entire school. It was as if, in that moment, she was rallying them all to fight back, to reclaim their voices from the very system that had tried to silence them. As they walked down the hall toward their lockers, Michael noticed a few more students glancing at him, some with newfound respect, others with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The whispers had started, the murmurs of rebellion growing louder with every passing day. But despite the glances and the whispered conversations, Michael felt something shift inside him. The weight on his shoulders, though still present, felt just a little lighter. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. That evening, after dinner, Michael found himself in front of the piano again. He had been playing more often lately, needing the release that music provided, a way to channel everything he was feeling into something tangible. As his fingers glided over the keys, the music took on a life of its own, mirroring the chaos in his mind. The tension, the uncertainty, the fear, it was all there, but so was something else, determination. For the first time in days, Michael played without thinking about Mr. Johnson, without worrying about what would happen next. He just played, letting the music guide him through the maze of his emotions. But as he finished the piece and his fingers rested lightly on the keys, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than himself. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about a teacher or a classroom, it was about something more profound, something that could change everything. The next day, when Michael entered Mr. Johnson's class, he felt the difference immediately. The tension was palpable, almost like an electric charge hanging in the air. Mr. Johnson was already at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the students as they took their seats. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by something darker, more guarded. "Good morning, class," Mr. Johnson said, his voice clipped. "Today, we're going to continue our discussion. I hope you all have your thoughts prepared." As he began speaking, Michael's mind drifted. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, the weight of their stares pressing in from all directions. And for the first time, Michael didn't shrink away from it. Instead, he met their gazes, one by one. He was no longer just the target. He was part of something bigger. As the class went on, Michael found himself less and less bothered by Mr. Johnson's attempts to assert control. The words, once sharp and biting, seemed to lose their power. It was as if something had shifted in the balance of power. The cracks in Mr. Johnson's armor were starting to widen, and Michael was beginning to see how he could use that to his advantage. But he couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. That afternoon, as Michael walked out of the school with Zoe, he could feel the eyes on him again. But this time, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like curiosity. Hope. He could feel the storm building, he could see it in the whispers and glances, hear it in the quiet conversations in the hallways. People were starting to question everything they had been told. They were starting to see through the veil that had been cast over their eyes for so long. And Michael? Michael knew that the time for standing quietly in the shadows was over. The time to fight back was now. But it wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs too. That night, as Michael sat at his piano once more, he played with more urgency than ever before. The music wasn't just a release, it was a rallying cry. It was a message to anyone who could hear it, anyone who had the courage to stand up. The storm was coming, and this time, Michael wasn't going to face it alone. The next few days felt like a heavy storm cloud hanging over Michael's life. Every hallway seemed a little quieter, the whispers a little more pronounced, and the weight of the world a little harder to carry. But with every passing moment, Michael's resolve only grew stronger. The storm wasn't just inevitable, it was coming for Mr. Johnson, for the system that had tried to keep him down. And Michael was ready. It started small, at first. A few students here and there would approach him between classes, offering small nods of support. Zoe, of course, was always there, her quiet determination contagious. "Keep playing," she'd say sometimes. "You never know who's listening." And Michael was starting to realize that she was right. The more he played, the more the music seemed to spread. Word had gotten around that he could play the piano like a pro, and it was becoming less about the teacher's cruelty and more about the one thing Mr. Johnson couldn't control, Michael's talent, his voice, his music. The same music that had brought him peace in times of turmoil was now starting to fuel something much greater. But Mr. Johnson wasn't an easy opponent. He had his own ways of maintaining control, his own methods of keeping the students in line. It didn't take long before he began to escalate the situation. It was a Monday morning when Michael walked into the classroom, his usual calm masked by an undercurrent of tension. As he sat at his desk, he noticed something was off. The students were unusually quiet, eyes darting around, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Michael's stomach tightened. Something was coming. Mr. Johnson entered the room with an air of authority, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't greet the class as usual. Instead, he stood at the front, hands resting on the desk, eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for its next target. "We're going to have a little conversation today," Mr. Johnson said, his voice low and controlled. A conversation about respect. About authority. And about who gets to decide what's right. Michael's stomach churned. This is it, he thought. He's going to make his move. As the lesson unfolded, Michael could feel Mr. Johnson's eyes on him, every word laced with meaning, every glance an unspoken threat. Mr. Johnson's tone grew sharper as the class continued, each sentence more pointed than the last. You all know how important it is to respect the rules, Mr. Johnson said, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Michael. Without rules, we have chaos. And chaos, as we all know, can be dangerous. Michael's pulse quickened, but he didn't break eye contact. He wasn't going to let Mr. Johnson see him sweat. Not today. He wasn't the same person who had walked into this classroom a few weeks ago, defeated and unsure. He was stronger now. He had something that Mr. Johnson didn't, the power of his own voice. And if he had to use it to stand up for himself, he would. Zoe, sitting nearby, leaned over and whispered, "Stay strong. We've got your back." Her words were a lifeline, and Michael squeezed his fists beneath the desk. He was going to need every ounce of strength he had. The class continued, and Mr. Johnson's words grew even more insistent. "We've seen people break the rules before," he said, his voice growing cold. "And we've seen what happens when they do." He paused, his gaze fixed on Michael as if daring him to respond. "What do you think, Michael? Do you think the rules apply to everyone? Or do you think some people are above them?" Michael's heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The weight of the classroom, of the expectations, seemed unbearable. But then something clicked inside of him. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about Mr. Johnson. This was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt small, for everyone who had been pushed down and silenced. He wasn't going to let Mr. Johnson win. Not like this. Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I think," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that everyone should be treated equally. No one is above the rules, and no one should have the power to make others feel less than." There was a sharp intake of breath from the class, followed by an uncomfortable silence. Mr. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pressed his lips together in a thin line, his jaw clenched. "Well, Michael," Mr. Johnson said finally, his voice laced with venom, "I think we'll see if you still feel that way after I'm done with you." The threat hung in the air like a cloud ready to burst. Michael's hands trembled beneath his desk, but he held his ground. He wasn't afraid anymore. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Michael's mind was consumed by the weight of the threat, by the realization that Mr. Johnson was no longer simply trying to control him, he was trying to destroy him. But as he walked through the halls, something began to shift inside of him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing tall, about taking control of his own narrative. Zoe walked beside him, her presence a steadying force. "You did good," she said. "Don't let him intimidate you. We've all got your back." Michael gave her a small smile, though he could feel the storm still swirling inside him. "Thanks. But I think we need to do more than just survive, don't you think?" Zoe looked at him, her eyes narrowing with determination. "You're right. We need to fight. And we will." That evening, as Michael sat at his piano once again, the weight of everything he had been feeling seemed to flood out through his fingers. Each note, each chord was an expression of the anger, the frustration, the fear, and the hope that still burned inside him. He played louder than before, his fingers flying across the keys with a kind of urgency he hadn't felt in days. The storm was building. The winds were rising. But this time, Michael wasn't waiting for it to break. He was going to meet it head-on. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The day after the confrontation with Mr. Johnson, the tension in the school had reached a boiling point. The halls felt heavy, as if everyone could sense that something was about to happen. It wasn't just Michael who had felt the sting of Mr. Johnson's words, he had become a symbol for the entire student body, especially those who had long felt oppressed by the authoritarian figure. Michael wasn't just a kid anymore, he was a representative of something much bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. The morning was eerily quiet as Michael walked into class, his footsteps echoing against the cold tile floors. He could sense the shift in the air even before he stepped through the door. Students who had once stayed silent were now looking at him, some with admiration, others with a newfound respect. Even those who had previously ignored him were offering small nods of acknowledgement, as if his defiance had ignited something in them. But there was still a heavy tension in the room. Mr. Johnson stood by the front of the classroom, his arms folded tightly across his chest. His face was set in a hard expression, but Michael could see the flicker of something else in his eyes, resentment. The teacher was calculating, trying to figure out his next move. Michael knew that things were far from over. As the class settled in, Mr. Johnson began speaking, his voice more controlled than it had been the previous day. But Michael could hear the undercurrent of anger in his tone. "Today, we're going to continue our lesson on respect and responsibility," he said, his eyes sweeping over the room before landing on Michael. "It's important that we all understand the value of discipline and maintaining order." Michael sat up straighter in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of his desk. The words felt like a veiled threat, an attempt to undermine everything Michael had stood up for. Mr. Johnson wasn't just teaching now, he was trying to remind everyone who was in charge. But Michael wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The class began, and Mr. Johnson started his usual lecture. But this time, Michael wasn't paying attention to the lesson. His mind was elsewhere, turning over the possibilities of what could happen next. The confrontation the day before had set something in motion, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He needed to be prepared. The next move was crucial. Zoe leaned over during the lesson, her voice barely a whisper. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes flicking between Michael and Mr. Johnson. Michael nodded, though he could feel the familiar tension tightening in his chest. "Yeah," he muttered, "but something's not right. I can feel it. He's planning something." Zoe didn't respond immediately, but Michael could see the same concern in her eyes. "Just be ready," she said softly. "We've got your back. Don't let him push you around." The quiet reassurance from Zoe, who had been his ally through this entire ordeal, was exactly what Michael needed to hear. She believed in him, and for the first time, Michael was starting to believe in himself, too. As the lesson dragged on, Michael's attention was once again drawn to Mr. Johnson's constant gaze. He was watching him, studying him, waiting for a reaction. But Michael had learned not to react to the subtle provocations. He wasn't going to be baited. He wasn't going to give Mr. Johnson the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Students began packing up their things, and Michael stood up, gathering his books. As he made his way toward the door, Mr. Johnson called out to him in a tone that made the hair on the back of Michael's neck stand on end. "Michael," Mr. Johnson said, his voice cold. "Stay behind for a moment. I need to have a word with you." The rest of the students filed out, leaving Michael and Mr. Johnson alone in the room. Michael's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't show it. He wasn't going to let Mr. Johnson intimidate him. As the door closed behind the last student, Mr. Johnson walked toward him, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "I've given you chances, Michael," Mr. Johnson began, his voice low and dangerous. "But now, you've crossed a line. I won't tolerate disrespect in my classroom." Michael squared his shoulders, standing tall. "I didn't disrespect you, Mr. Johnson. I just told the truth." Mr. Johnson's eyes flashed. "The truth? The truth is, you don't belong here, Michael. You don't fit in. You think you can just play the piano and make everything better. You think that makes you special. You're not above the rules, and you're not above me. Michael felt a sudden surge of anger. But this time, it wasn't the familiar rage he'd felt in the past, it was the quiet, controlled anger of someone who finally understood his own worth. He didn't need Mr. Johnson's approval. He didn't need anyone's approval. "I'm not trying to be special," Michael said, his voice firm but steady. "I'm just trying to be me. And if you can't handle that, maybe it's you who doesn't belong here." For a moment, there was silence. The words hung in the air, thick with defiance. Mr. Johnson's fists clenched at his sides, and Michael saw a flicker of something dangerous in his teacher's eyes. "You're making a mistake," Mr. Johnson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll regret this." But Michael didn't back down. "No, Mr. Johnson. I think you will." As Michael walked out of the classroom, his heart was pounding, but a sense of relief washed over him. He had stood his ground. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was backing down from anything. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. As he reached the hallway, he saw Zoe waiting for him. She gave him a small, proud smile as he approached. "You okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Michael nodded, his chest still tight with the adrenaline of the encounter. "Yeah. It's not over, but I'm not backing down. I'm done being afraid of him." Zoe's smile widened. "That's what I like to hear. You're not in this alone, Michael. We're all in this together." That evening, as Michael sat at the piano, the weight of the day began to sink in. He played again, this time with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The music flowed from him, each note an echo of his determination. The storm wasn't over yet, but Michael was ready for it. He wasn't just going to survive this fight, he was going to win. And as the final chord echoed in the quiet room, Michael realized one thing: no matter what happened next, he had already won. He had found his voice, and that was something Mr. Johnson could never take from him. Tomorrow, the spark would turn into a fire. The next day arrived with a strange sense of anticipation. The air was thick with the unspoken tension that had been building over the past few weeks. Michael could feel it as soon as he stepped into the school, a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that things were about to come to a head. The students were quieter, more observant. Some looked at him with hope in their eyes, others with uncertainty. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. As Michael walked into his first class of the day, he noticed immediately that the usual chatter was absent. Even the clatter of lockers and the usual morning rush felt muted. It was as if the school itself was holding its breath. Zoe was waiting for him by his locker, her face serious but determined. "You good?" she asked quietly. Michael nodded. "Yeah. I'm ready for this." The bell rang, and the students filed into their classrooms. When Michael entered his homeroom, the same familiar tension seemed to settle in the room. Mr. Johnson had a tightness around his eyes, something sharp and calculating, as if he were preparing for battle. It wasn't the casual, indifferent stare he'd worn before, this was different. He was ready to take control once and for all. The morning passed in a blur. Every time Michael glanced at Mr. Johnson, he could feel the weight of his eyes. It was clear the teacher was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Michael was no longer afraid. He had learned that standing up for himself wasn't just about surviving, it was about reclaiming his dignity, his voice, and his place in the world. By the time lunch rolled around, the entire school seemed to be talking about what had happened. Word had spread quickly, about the fight, about Michael's refusal to back down, and about the confrontation between him and Mr. Johnson. Some students were whispering in corners, others were making bets on what would happen next. But Michael wasn't concerned with rumors or gossip. He was focused. He had a plan. Zoe found him again as he sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at his half-eaten sandwich. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" she asked, sitting across from him. Michael's mind raced, but he had made up his mind. He couldn't let this go on any longer. It was time to take the fight straight to Mr. Johnson, and to the entire school. "I'm going to confront him today," Michael said quietly, his eyes fixed on the table. "Once and for all." Zoe's eyes widened, but she nodded. "I'm with you." "We all are." The final bell of the day echoed through the halls, and Michael walked toward the classroom with a sense of purpose. The closer he got to Mr. Johnson's classroom, the heavier his heart felt, but it wasn't fear. It was the weight of knowing this moment would define everything. There was no turning back. As he approached the door, he found Zoe standing outside, her arms crossed, waiting for him. "We've got your back," she said, her voice steady. Michael nodded, grateful for her support. "Thanks. Let's do this." When Michael opened the door to Mr. Johnson's classroom, the room fell silent. It wasn't just the teacher who stopped talking, it was everyone. The students, who had been murmuring in the back of the class, turned their attention to him. Michael stepped into the room, his eyes locked on Mr. Johnson, who stood behind his desk with a calculating look on his face. "You've been avoiding me," Mr. Johnson said, his voice low. "You think I'm just going to let this go? You think you can come in here, defy me, and everything will be fine?" Michael didn't flinch. "No," he said, his voice clear. "I think it's time for you to understand something. I'm not afraid of you anymore. You can't control me." The tension in the room was palpable. The students were all watching, waiting for what would happen next. This was more than a confrontation. This was the moment that would define who Michael was, and who Mr. Johnson would be. Mr. Johnson narrowed his eyes, his fingers tapping on the desk. "You don't get it, do you, Michael? You've crossed a line, and I'm not going to let you just walk away from this. I'll make sure you regret standing up to me." Michael stood tall, his heart racing, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "I'm not going to back down. You've made me feel small for far too long, but I'm done. You can't make me feel less than who I am." A long silence passed. Mr. Johnson stared at Michael, and for the first time, the teacher's expression wavered. The power he had once held so confidently was slipping away. Michael had taken control, not just of the situation, but of his own future. But this wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about the students, too. The quiet murmurings, the whispers of support, the look in the eyes of his classmates, Michael could feel their energy behind him. He wasn't alone. This wasn't just his fight. "I know what you've been trying to do," Michael said, his voice louder now. "But the truth is, it's over. You've underestimated me. And now, I'm going to make sure everyone sees that." The room held its breath. Mr. Johnson's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't move. Michael felt a sense of power wash over him, the kind he had never known before. He was no longer just a student, no longer just a kid. He was a force in that room, and nothing could take that away. Zoe stepped forward, standing next to Michael. "And you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all of us. We're done being afraid. We won't let you control us anymore." The other students, one by one, began to rise from their seats. They stood in solidarity, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. Michael's heart swelled with pride. This was it. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. Mr. Johnson stood frozen, his face pale. The power he had once wielded so easily was gone. For the first time in his career, he was faced with a united front, and it shook him to his core. "I'm not done," Mr. Johnson spat, his voice shaking. "I'll make sure you pay for this." But Michael wasn't scared anymore. "We'll see about that." The next few days were a blur. There were meetings, phone calls to parents, and even a visit from the principal. Mr. Johnson tried to spin the situation in his favor, but the support Michael had garnered from his peers was undeniable. The students who had once been silent now stood behind him, their voices loud and unwavering. Michael had given them something to believe in. In the end, Mr. Johnson was removed from the school. The administration had no choice but to act, and his power was stripped away. For the first time, Michael realized that the system didn't have to control him, it was the students who had the power. As the final bell rang on the last day of school, Michael stood outside, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't just about winning the battle against Mr. Johnson. It was about realizing that his voice mattered, that he could stand up for himself, and that he wasn't alone. Zoe stood beside him, her smile wide. "You did it. We did it." Michael grinned, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "We did. And we're just getting started." As the sun set over the school, Michael knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for equality, for respect, for the right to be heard, it wasn't over. But he had found his strength, and nothing could take that away from him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?